Sharks are an incredibly diverse group of species that have adapted to live in almost every marine habitat. They are found in shallow waters all the way down into the deep sea. And so today we're going to be talking about deep sea sharks. Now, these words might conjure up some images of some pretty freaky looking fish, but actually things aren't quite so simple as normal shallow water sharks and weird deep sea sharks. So here are the sharks of the deep sea. I'm also joined in this video by marine biologist and shark researcher B, who you can find on TikTok as well as Instagram at @BLovesTheSea, where she makes amazing content about sharks, whales, deep sea creatures and much more. And thank you so much for writing this video. So when does the sea become the deep sea? The current definition is that the deep sea is anything deeper than 200 meters, with the caveat that it also has to be beyond the edge of the continental shelf. The justification for this depth is that below this, plant life is largely absent because so little light reaches here that photosynthesis doesn't occur. Phytoplankton photosynthesizing is a really important driver of marine biodiversity and biomass because it is the base of the food web, increasing available energy. And so where there isn't phytoplankton, it is a very different habitat. So from the surface to 200 meters is the sunlight zone or the epipelagic zone. Then, from 200 meters to 1000 meters is the first zone of the deep sea, the twilight zone or mesopelagic zone, where there is still a little bit of light. Then, from 1000 meters to 4000 meters is the midnight zone or bathypelagic zone, where there is no light, and from 4000 meters to 6000 meters is the abyssal zone or the abyssopelagic. And below 6000 meters is the hadal zone or hadopelagic, which only occurs in trenches. The very deepest trench is the Mariana Trench, and the deepest point in this is Challenger Deep at 10,935 meters. And for context, average depth of the ocean is around 3,700 meters.
But there's a bit of controversy with the idea that anything below 200 meters is the deep sea. First is how this definition came to be. Early marine science emerged around the North Atlantic and Western countries in general, meaning when basic oceanography terms were being defined, they were based on local conditions, and these happened to be oceans where there was a large proportion of the continental shelf. And so, the ocean deeper than the continental shelf was seen as being the deep sea. For example, the combined shelf area of the North Atlantic, Mediterranean, Black Sea and Arctic, where early exploration occurred, is 14 million kilometers squared, which is 45.7% of global continental shelf, despite being just 16.8% of the ocean. But the significance of this 200-meter contour is much less in other oceans with less continental shelf, such as the South Atlantic, South Pacific and Indian Oceans are 55% of the ocean, but have only 26% of global shelf area. So this 200-meter boundary is really an artifact of the early days of marine exploration. Another consideration is whether this boundary really has any meaning in terms of light. First, there are some exceptions to the 200-meter limit for plant growth, though very rare, with seaweeds being found at 295 meters. Secondly, how deep sunlight travels in an ocean depends on local oceanographic processes influencing the clarity of the water. So, seawater has a higher refractive index than air, meaning that when the ocean is flat, the 180-degree dome of the sky gets compressed underwater into a 97-degree cone, which is brighter than surrounding space light, and this is called Snell's window. The dominance of Snell's window declines with depth, disappearing in the clearest seawater below the asymptotic depth at 400 meters. So sunlight is still significant at twice the depth that is considered to be the deep sea. And the main thing that questions this 200-meter boundary for the deep sea is that animals that are considered to be the shallow or deep sea creatures don't really stick to our definitions and regularly cross this arbitrary boundary, which we will be discussing in this video in terms of sharks. But for the purpose of this video, we will be using the current agreed definition of anything below 200 meters being the deep sea.
So the ocean's surface covers about 70% of our planet, and its volume accounts for 90% of the habitat on Earth. Since the deep sea goes from 200 meters to an average of 3,700 meters, something like 98% of the ocean is the deep sea. So the deep sea isn't some strange, unique habitat, it's actually the majority habitat on the planet. What is this habitat like? As we have said, there is a lack of light, from a limited amount in the twilight zone to none in the midnight zone and below. The lack of primary production from photosynthesis also means that there is a lack of food. There's also a lack of oxygen because oxygen gets into seawater at the surface and has to be brought to the deep sea by circulation. Another factor is colder temperatures, as seawater is mainly heated at the surface by sunlight, and because cold water is denser, so it sinks to the bottom of the ocean. The final consideration is the very high pressure. At the average ocean depth of 3,700 meters, the pressure is nearly 400 times greater than it is at the surface. Amazingly, at least half of the world's sharks are found in the deep sea. How do they cope with living in this environment? Let's start by looking at the adaptations that many deep sea sharks have. First is the consideration of the lack of sunlight. So sharks that live in the twilight zone where there is still a little light have large eyes to absorb as much as possible, as well as increased photoreceptor density. This also helps them to see another type of light in the deep sea, bioluminescence, where animals create their own light by converting chemical energy to radiant energy. And some sharks even create their own bioluminescence, which is blue-green as these wavelengths travel best through the water. Some use it for camouflage, having light on their bellies, so that from below they blend in with the downwelling light. Others have it on their flanks for intraspecific communication, so mutual recognition in schools and courtship, and it can also be to deter predators or attract prey. Another consideration is the generally extreme environment of high pressure, cold temperature, lack of oxygen, and lack of food. Deep sea sharks tend to live life in the slow lane compared to shallow water sharks. You might have seen footage of deep sea sharks gliding along the ocean floor, something you don't see in shallow water sharks. Well, near neutral buoyancy is important for marine animals to move efficiently in their 3D environment. Bony fish generally have swim bladders, an organ filled with air, to help maintain buoyancy. But cartilaginous fish don't have swim bladders, instead using their liver filled with low-density oil. Shallow water sharks tend to be slightly negatively buoyant, so if they stop swimming, they sink. And so they have to swim continuously to generate lift from their fins to be neutrally buoyant. Deep sea sharks have livers that provide more buoyancy due to their higher lipid composition and being particularly large compared to their size, reaching around 20% of their body length. At the surface, they are positively buoyant, but under the high pressure of the deep sea, they are neutrally buoyant or even positively buoyant, which enables them to swim slowly without sinking. And so they have smaller fins and reduced muscle mass, and generally slower metabolic rates, helping to reduce their energy and oxygen consumption, enabling them to use cold habitats with limited food resources. And another adaptation to cope with the lack of food is some pretty specialist feeding mechanisms, which we will talk about next.
We'll now take a look at some specific deep sea sharks and their unique adaptations. Let's start off with the famous weird deep sea sharks. The megamouth is a large shark reaching up to around 5.5 meters and is named after its proportionally large mouth. It's one of 3 filter-feeding sharks, along with the whale shark and the basking shark, and it uses a white band in its upper jaw to reflect downwelling light or bioluminescence in order to attract plankton towards its mouth. The goblin shark reaches 4.7 meters and is named after its long, goblin-like nose. It has a protrusible jaw that slingshots forwards to grab prey, going from open to closed in a third of a second, which compensates for its flabby body and slow swim speed. The frilled shark reaches 2 meters and gets its name from its 6 pairs of gills with one connecting under the throat. It has an eel-like or serpent way of swimming, and as well as looking like a sea serpent, we think that it may actually strike at prey like a snake, using whirl-like teeth that face backwards to grip onto prey, then swallow it whole. So the frilled shark is part of a group called the 6 and 7 gill sharks, named after their extra gills, whilst most sharks only have 5 pairs. This group, the hexangiforms, was the first modern shark group to appear, around 195 million years ago at the start of the Jurassic. And so we think that the extra gills may be an ancestral trait that they never lost, because it's adaptive to coping with the low oxygen levels in the deep sea. The sleeper sharks are another deep sea group, and this contains the Greenland shark, which is a really slow metabolism and life cycle, only reaching sexual maturity at 150 years old and living as long as 270 to 500 years, and they're scavengers, eating anything from dogs to seals to horses to polar bears. And there was once a Greenland shark who'd gone on a binge and eaten so much moose that he was found choking on a beach and had to be helped by some humans pulling the moose out of him and then pushing him back out to sea. So, though these famous large deep sea sharks are what get the most attention, actually, the majority of deep sea sharks are less than a metre long. And so, a typical shark really isn't a blue shallow water shark, it's a little brown shark in the deep sea. 2 families of these little sharks, the kitefin and the lantern sharks, are the sharks which can produce bioluminescence. The viper dogfish is a species of lantern shark, and it has the counter-illumination belly light. It also has a protruding jaw with gripping teeth to grab onto prey and again swallow them whole. The cookie cutter is a species of kitefin shark. It also has the belly light for counter-illumination and produces the brightest glowing light of any shark, but it has a collar where it doesn't have any photophores. It's thought that this may be a lure, creating a silhouette that looks like a smaller animal in order to attract prey. Once prey is near, it uses its specialist feeding strategy from which it gets its name. So it has the largest teeth to body ratio of any shark, and the entire row is connected together. And it has a specialised pharynx which creates suction, so it's able to latch onto much larger animals and take out a cookie-shaped chunk of flesh. This makes the shark actually a parasite because normally the prey doesn't die from this. The pocket shark is another kitefin shark, so there are two species, each known from only one specimen, and they're named after a pocket behind their pectoral fin which releases a cloud of bioluminescent fluid that we think is used to mask them from or distract predators so that they can escape, kind of similar to how an octopus uses its cloud of ink. A more scientific way of dividing up the deep sea sharks than big and small is by their habitat use. So there are benthic sharks which stay close to the seafloor. This is mainly cat sharks like the chain cat shark and rough sharks like the Caribbean rough shark. Then there are benthic migrators, who also stay near the seafloor but migrate upwards to feed in more productive waters at night to avoid shallower predators. This is the dogfish like the gulper sharks and sleeper sharks like the Greenland. And the third type brings us on to our next topic. This is the pelagic migrators, who move daily up and down through the water column.
Quite a few sharks that are thought of as deep-sea species actually spend half their lives in the shallows. From big sharks like the megamouth and goblin down to the little brown bioluminescent ones, including the cookie cutter. To explain this, we will again take a look at early marine science. So during World War II, Navy sonar often detected phantom seafloor bottoms that rose by night and sank by day. In 1948, it was discovered to be an area of high concentration of marine organisms that live in the water column, such as fish whose swim bladders reflected the sonar, squid, jellyfish, and zooplankton such as copepods. And this is known as the deep scattering layer. This layer is found in the twilight zone, but the majority of organisms that make up the layer do a behaviour called diel vertical migration, which is where they move up to the sunlight zone at nighttime. What's happening is that the sunlight zone contains photosynthetic plankton, and so zooplankton are coming up to feed on this, with the darkness protecting them from sunlight zone predators. But they are then followed up by their predators, such as the lanternfishes, and the predators of these predators follow up, and so on. Then, at dawn, they all migrate back down. This can be considered the largest animal migration on the planet, and the Twilight Zone fish that take part in this include the most abundant marine organisms on the planet, fish such as lanternfish and bristlemouths. So this layer is a really important food source within the ocean. So what's happening with the sharks is that they are taking part in this migration. Megamouth sharks are coming up to feed on krill and zooplankton like larvae, whilst the goblin shark is coming to feed further up the food chain. And the cookie cutter is trying to take bites out of the largest animals that are migrating up, like oarfish and even megamouths.
And also, the reverse is true. Many pelagic sharks that are typically thought of as shallow water species are known to venture into the deep sea. So lots of these sharks commonly dive past the 200-metre boundary into the twilight zone, like thresher, blue, oceanic whitetip, scalloped hammerheads, and even the most famous shallow water shark, the great white. But sometimes these species are known to go even deeper, down into the midnight zone. Great whites have often been recorded going as far as 1,000 metres, with a record of 1,277 metres. Oceanic whitetip's record is 1,082 metres, scalloped hammerheads is 1,240 metres, basking sharks have been recorded going to 1,504 metres, and whale sharks is to 1,912 metres, making them the deepest diving fish. The regularity of these dives and the length of time spent in the deep sea varies for different species, and can also vary within a species. So, thresher sharks regularly visit the deep sea, and they strictly follow diel vertical migration, and so, like the pelagic migratory deep sea sharks, spend half their lives in the deep sea in the daytime and come to shallow waters at night. Blue sharks make more irregular dives, spending the majority of their lives in shallow waters but making short, about an hour dives corresponding to the time and position of diel vertical migration. Great whites spend time in shallow waters when they're around the continental shelf, but when they do oceanic large-scale movements, they do periodic deep dives. dives. Some are associated with dive vertical migration, but they are also known to do rapid oscillatory diving, which are repeated rapid dives to great depths, sometimes called yo-yo dives. Basking sharks also sometimes follow dive vertical migration, other times do reverse dive vertical migration, also do rapid oscillatory dives, and other times spend weeks or months in the deep sea, so having seasonal residency there. And whale sharks have been known to make dives associated with dive vertical migration as well as yo-yo dives. We still don't know exactly why these sharks are making these dives, and as you can tell from the different depths and behaviours, there are probably a number of different factors going on. One idea is that these dives may be linked to social behaviour. So great whites are known to migrate to an area halfway between Baja California and Hawaii called the White Shark Cafe, and it's here that they do a lot of their rapid oscillatory deep dives. It's mainly males that congregate here, with females visiting only briefly, so it's suggested that they're coming to this area to form a mating leg, and so one potential reason for the rapid repeated dives is that there are courtship behaviour demonstrating fitness. But remember that basking sharks also make these types of rapid repeated dives, and it isn't thought to be to do with courtship, as they're known to come to the surface to perform social and courtship behaviours. And for the other species dives, social behaviour has been proposed but largely dismissed. Another theory is that these dives are for foraging. For the dives that follow dive vertical migration, their main suggested reason is that the sharks are diving to feed on the abundance of food in the deep scattering layer. For basking sharks, which are following plankton, their change from dive to reverse dive migration may be to do with plankton changing depths during different seasons, and the same for their seasonal residency at depth. Also, when sharks' dives seem to almost do dive vertical migration but slightly vary, it may be because they're encountering unfavourable conditions in the deep sea that alter their course. So there isn't any direct evidence for this foraging theory, but indirect evidence comes from the shapes of dive profiles suggesting foraging behaviour, and also analysis of stomach contents suggesting twilight zone species. This does seem a likely reason for the dives associated with dive vertical migration, but it seems less likely for the infrequent extreme yo-yo dives. Another idea is navigation. All these sharks are pelagic and highly migratory, and accurate navigation requires knowing direction of travel and potentially geographic position. So it's been suggested that these dives might play a role in the sharks orienting themselves. Sharks are known to have the ability to detect electric fields, and there's some evidence that they can also detect magnetic fields. It's suggested that they can detect the Earth's magnetic field and use this to navigate. So perhaps they're diving down to better detect this field at depth. A study found that scalloped hammerheads perform highly directional swimming at depth that enabled them to perform daily migrations to and away from seamounts, suggesting that they're using the change in geomagnetic field intensity caused by the ridges and valleys to locate it. There are also other cues and gradients that they could be detecting, like electric fields, chemicals, and just simply following topographic features. This is the most plausible explanation for the extreme rapid deep dives seen during long-distance movements, such as for great whites. Another idea that's also linked to long-distance movement is that these dives help to save energy. This is again mainly for rapid, repeated deep dives. Remember that these shallow water sharks are negatively buoyant. So it's suggested that rather than swimming at a level depth between 2 points, it's more energy efficient to travel by gliding down on descent, exerting minimal energy, and then actively swimming up on ascent. But it has been suggested that natural selection simply would have favoured neutral buoyancy if minimising the cost of horizontal transport was the main function of deep diving. So it may be that these dives do save energy while searching the water column for food, but it's not that their primary function is to save energy. And finally, there's the idea of temperature regulation. So the majority of sharks are ectotherms, meaning their body temperature depends on external temperature, and they must maintain their internal temperature in their favourable range in order to maximise performance. So perhaps some of these dives are to do with the sharks getting overheated in the sunlight zone and moving down to the depths to cool down. Other proposed ideas are simply that they're doing predator avoidance, and another idea is that they're making these dives to get rid of parasites, such as whale sharks trying to remove their remoras.
The point is, we don't yet understand the reasons behind shallow water sharks' deep diving behaviour. But they must have a good reason, because as we have said, in the deep sea they will be facing extreme conditions. Deep sea sharks have evolved special adaptations to cope, so how do shallow water sharks cope? and these shallow water sharks are even diving past the depths that many deep sea sharks live at. The first challenge to consider is the cold and low oxygen at depth, which would hinder the functioning of organs. Great whites, other white sharks, thresher sharks, and basking sharks all have regional endothermy, essentially being warm-blooded, and so they may be able to maintain an elevated temperature for key organs whilst diving into the cold deep sea. It has also been found that both blue sharks and white sharks have made their deep dives to 1,000 meters by following eddies, warm temperature anomalies, so perhaps this is one way of diving deep without getting too cold. And whale sharks' large size results in gigantothermy, where their smaller surface area to volume ratio means they take a long time to lose body heat and cool down. Whale sharks being the largest fish and the deepest diving fish suggests that perhaps cold is the limiting factor for sharks' deep dives. Scalloped hammerheads have been found to hold their breath whilst they dive into the deep. Gills are very good at transferring heat and so lead to rapid cooling, so they close their gills to stop water flowing over them, stopping heat loss but also stopping them getting oxygen. If this is found in other deep diving species, then it would suggest that oxygen is actually the limiting factor. Another consideration is the lack of light and how this prevents visual targeting of prey. It has been found that whale sharks have blue-shifted rhodopsin, a protein involved in vision, which is a signature of deep-sea adaptation, enabling them to detect blue light, which penetrates farthest into this deep sea. They activate this in the deep and then deactivate at the surface so they can see the normal spectrum.
The final point is that deep sea sharks don't actually live that far into the deep sea. So though you get sharks living or diving down into the midnight zone, which starts at 1,000 meters, sharks are rare below 3,000 meters and basically absent below 4,000 meters, which is where the abyssal zone starts, except one potential sighting of a gulper shark at 4,050 meters in 1954. That's a bit dubious. To remind you, the hadal zone then starts at 6,000 meters, and the deepest part of the ocean is nearly 11,000 meters. You get bony fish as far as the hadal zone, with the deepest being the snailfish, with the record at 8,336 meters. So why are sharks absent from the abyss? Well, again, we don't really know. There have only been a few papers on this subject, proposing a few potential factors, and these factors aren't mutually exclusive, as in it could be a combination. One is to do with the way that sharks control their buoyancy, using an oil-filled liver. This has a high energetic cost, and since food availability decreases with depth, there may just be a limit to them being able to support this, whereas bony fish use a swim bladder, or some of the deepest bony fish just use watery tissues. And a bony fish could use their liver entirely to support periods of fasting, while sharks also have to use their liver to maintain buoyancy. And since sharks are typically at higher trophic levels than bony fish, especially at great depths, they simply just require more food in general. Another theory is to do with the way that sharks osmoregulate. So sharks don't pee. They instead absorb urine into their flesh and later expel it through their skin. The more scientific phrasing is that they store urea. They store this urea to help retain body water. Urea is destabilized by high hydrostatic pressure, so deep sea sharks need high levels of trimethylamine oxide to counteract the destabilization of urea by the pressure. So it could be an inability to produce enough TMAO to counteract pressure beyond 4,000 meters, or an inability to minimize urea levels or replace urea with other solutes. It has been found that there's a decline in the urea stored in sharks with depth, and if the trend is extrapolated, there should be zero urea at around 4,700 meters. Whereas bony fish osmoregulate differently, they basically drink seawater.
This brings us to a point that I'm sure a lot of you will have been thinking this whole time. What about Megalodon? Could it be hiding down in the depths somewhere and actually still be alive today? Well, the short answer is no. Definitely no. The idea that the giant megalodon could somehow be inhabiting the deepest reaches of the ocean can be attributed to the author of the Meg book series, Steve Alton, and the films that have since been made based on them. It's understandably a very appealing idea, and although the films are not exactly the most scientifically rigorous pieces of media, there are some cool details included, such as how the megalodon in the film has extra gill slits, like how 6 and 7 gill sharks may have to help with low oxygen in the deep sea. However, everything we understand about the real megalodon's biology suggests that we would absolutely be aware if it was still alive today. Megalodon died out around 3.6 million years ago after terrorizing the inhabitants of the prehistoric oceans for almost 20 million years. Many factors seem to have contributed to its eventual disappearance, such as climatic shifts, changes in sea levels that may have destroyed the nursery sites for their young, and competition with other large marine predators. We actually have a fairly good fossil record for Megalodon, due to the fact that sharks continuously replace their teeth throughout their lives, and so many fossil teeth have been discovered all over the world. This also means that if they were still alive, we'd definitely be finding some very fresh looking meg teeth. There's also fossil evidence of what Megalodon was feeding on, with bite marks found on whale bones and on other marine mammals that indicate it was a predator of shallow water coastal species. Its teeth are often found in deposits that represent warm, shallow coastal seas too. So if it were still around, it wouldn't be deep down in the ocean away from its prey, it would be hunting whales near the coasts, where I'm pretty sure a lot of people would be seeing and filming them all the time. A megalodon that had survived and evolved to live deep in the ocean would be a very different shark compared to what it actually was. Plus, as of 2024, 27 humans have been to the very deepest point of the Mariana Trench, Challenger Deep, and even more have been to just within the trench. So if there was a giant evil megalodon lurking down there, it definitely would have eaten them. The environmental conditions of today's climate are also probably not ideal for Megalodon, which seems to have preferred warmer regions, and the modern food webs are also very different now to what they were like a few million years ago. Indeed, the actual structure of the ocean's ecosystems would almost certainly be very different if a huge super predator such as Megalodon were still present, and the impacts a population of such animals would have on the trophic levels below them would be very noticeable. There have been claims of some very fresh-looking Megalodon teeth being discovered which date to only a few thousand years ago, and therefore proving the monster shark lives. However, this has long since been discredited, with errors in the dating techniques resulting in much younger ages, and the style of preservation explaining why they look somewhat fresh. And there are of course also some videos and eyewitness stories that have been alleged to document living megalodons, but these have also turned out to be videos of different living species, such as sleeper sharks, which can reach up to 24 feet, and also of basking sharks, plus many of the eyewitness accounts sound a lot like they're describing whale sharks. But though the Megalodon isn't in the deep sea, there is a real giant six-gilled shark in the deep sea, the blunt-nosed six-gill, which appeared 150 million years before Megalodon ever did and is still around today.
But speaking of mega deep-sea sharks, I want to tell you a bit about my work on the megamouth shark. So, as we've said before, the megamouth shark is a species that lives in the deep sea, is a filter feeder, and reaches up to 5.5 meters, being named after its proportionally large mouth. This unique species was only discovered in 1976 when one became tangled in the anchor of a US Navy ship in Hawaii. Since then, it's been seen less than 300 times, with the majority of these sightings being dead specimens, either stranded on shore or caught by fisheries. The locations of these specimens do suggest the species has a global range, but there's a hotspot in East Asian waters. This has led to the majority of the sightings being from fisheries catchers in Taiwan. So when the megamouths do dive vertical migration at night, they get caught by drift net fisheries, which are targeting other species that do this migration, like thresher sharks, sunfish, and sailfish. Originally, the megamouths were bycatch, but after they were found to be valuable, it became targeted catch. They aren't targeted for their fins like other sharks, but for their meat. In Taiwan, the whale shark is called the tofu shark because its meat is soft like tofu, but after the whale shark became protected, the megamouth's similar meat filled this gap. In 2020, a ban on catching megamouths was introduced in Taiwan, so if a megamouth is caught, it must now be returned to the ocean, whether it's dead or alive. I'm working on a project investigating this catch ban for a documentary. So last summer, I was in Taiwan conducting interviews with conservation organisations, megamouth scientists, and a megamouth fisher. These interviews revealed that there's a number of issues with the catch and release policy, and that a lot of public information about the megamouth situation in Taiwan is simply incorrect. In May and June 2024, I went back to try and film the catch and release for documentary footage, but mainly to gain understanding of whether the sharks likely survive this catch and release. So my project's in collaboration with the Shark Lab in Taiwan, so that we could collect tissue samples and place acoustic tags on the megamouths. I ended up seeing 3 megamouths who were all alive when cut free from the net, and they swam away steadily, suggesting that they likely survived this release. So I hope to reveal the true story of the megamouth situation in Taiwan in a documentary soon, but I want to highlight that megamouth fishers aren't evil. It's just that whilst we see the megamouth as a beautiful, unique animal, they just see it as any other fish as a source of income which they depend on, just a bit of a large and strange looking fish. When catch bans are put in place for sharks, they have to consider the livelihoods of fishers and give them compensation or alternatives in order to be fair, but also to be effective in terms of being followed. The megamouth situation is a very specific case study of deep sea shark conservation involving a certain location and fishery. So I want to end by talking about the general global situation of deep sea shark conservation. So one thing that humans target sharks for is their liver oil, which is called squalene. Its main use is in cosmetics. Due to deep sea sharks having larger livers with high squalene content, they're especially targeted for this trade, and they're also targeted for their meats. In fact, 1/3 of deep sea sharks are targeted, and half the species targeted for the liver oil trade are considered to be threatened with extinction. Deep sea sharks are really sensitive to overexploitation because they have a low potential to recover from it. They have some of the slowest vertebrate life histories with the longest known lifespans and really low reproductive rates, so there's a very slow population growth. So we really need to take action to reduce fishing pressure. One thing that you can do to help is make sure that you buy cosmetics using plant-based squalene rather than from sharks.
Despite deep sea sharks being half the world's sharks, they are really understudied and data deficient. It is possible to study these species, it just takes a bit of hard work and often cooperation with fishers. Our knowledge of deep sea sharks and of the deep sea habitat is limited but growing, and I hope to see a paradigm shift in our understanding of and the importance given to the topic of sharks in the deep sea in the future. I hope we've made you really question what should be considered both the deep sea and deep sea sharks. Because when you have bull sharks known to dive to 256 meters and shallow water sharks diving far deeper than many deep sea sharks live, something a bit fishy is going on with our current paradigms. Thank you so much again to Bea for writing this video and recording with me. Be sure to check her out on TikTok, Instagram and YouTube. Her accounts will be linked below if you'd like to learn more about sharks and marine biology in general. And be sure to watch the other Shark Week video we did together on some amazing Jurassic sharks.